A quiet evening at Baker Street. The fire crackles gently as Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson sit on either side, immersed in conversation.
My dear fellow, life is infinitely stranger than anything the mind of man could invent. We would not dare to conceive the things which are really mere commonplaces of existence.
Sherlock pausing, his expression deepens with thought.
If we could fly out of that window, hand in hand, hover over this great city, and gently remove the roofs, we might peek in on the queerest happenings. Strange coincidences, intricate plannings, cross-purposes, and wonderful chains of events working through generations, leading to the most outré results. Fiction, with all its conventionalities and foreseen conclusions, would seem stale and unprofitable.
And yet, I am not convinced of it, Holmes. The cases reported in the papers are, as a rule, bald and vulgar. Realism pushed to its extreme limits, yet, it must be confessed, neither fascinating nor artistic.
A certain selection and discretion must be used in producing a realistic effect. This is often absent in police reports, where the platitudes of magistrates are given more weight than the vital details of the case. Depend upon it, Watson, there is nothing so unnatural as the commonplace.
I can quite understand your thinking so. Of course, in your position as unofficial advisor and helper to anyone puzzled across 3 continents, you're constantly exposed to the strange and bizarre.
Dr. Watson picking up the morning paper from the table, flipping through the pages.
But here, let's put your theory to the test. Here's the first heading I see, A Husband's Cruelty to His Wife. It's half a column of print, but I already know, without reading, that it's perfectly familiar. The other woman, the drink, the argument, the blow, the bruise, the sympathetic sister or landlady, it's all too predictable. The crudest of writers could do no worse.
Indeed, Watson, your example is an unfortunate one for your argument.
Holmes glancing quickly down the page, his eyes gleaming with interest.
This is the Dundas separation case, and as it happens, I had some involvement in clearing up small points here. The husband was a teetotaler, there was no other woman, and yet the complaint against him was most peculiar.
And what was it?
He had developed a peculiar habit of ending every meal by taking out his false teeth and hurling them at his wife. Hardly the sort of behavior that springs easily to the imagination of the average storyteller, wouldn't you agree? Take a pinch of snuff, Doctor, and concede that I've scored a point over your example.
Holmes extended his snuff box, crafted from old gold with a great amethyst at the center of the lid. The box's splendor contrasted sharply with his otherwise unassuming lifestyle.
An elegant little piece. It's unlike you, Holmes. Where did it come from?
Ah, I forgot I hadn't seen you for weeks. It's a souvenir from the King of Bohemia, a token of gratitude for my assistance with the Irene Adler papers.
And the ring. A remarkable piece.
A gift from the reigning family of Holland. The matter involved was of such delicacy that even you, my trusted chronicler, cannot hear the details.
And do you have a case on hand now?
Some 10 or 12, but none which present any feature of interest. They are important, you understand, without being interesting. Indeed, I have found that it is usually in unimportant matters that there is a field for observation and the quick analysis of cause and effect. This is what gives the charm to an investigation. The larger crimes are apt to be simpler. The bigger the crime, the more obvious, as a rule, is the motive. Except for one rather intricate matter referred to me from Marseilles, there is nothing currently that presents any features of interest. But it's possible that I may have something better within minutes, for this is one of my clients, or I am much mistaken.
Holmes rises from his chair and moves closer to the window. Standing between the parted blinds, he peers down at the neutral-tinted London street. Watson, curious, glances over his shoulder.
Who do you see, Holmes?
On the pavement opposite, a large woman stands hesitantly. She is draped in a heavy fur boa, and a large curling red feather adorns her broad-brimmed hat, tilted coquettishly over one ear in a Duchess of Devonshire style. Her fingers fidget nervously with her glove buttons as her body sways, oscillating between resolve and hesitation. Finally, with a determined plunge, she hurries across the road. A sharp clang of the bell echoes through the apartment.
I have seen those symptoms before, Watson. Oscillation upon the pavement always signals an affaire d'occur. She seeks advice but hesitates, uncertain if the matter is too delicate to share. Even here, we can discriminate. When a woman is seriously wronged by a man, she no longer oscillates. The usual symptom then is a broken bell wire. Here, we can deduce that it's a love matter. But this maiden is more perplexed or grieved than angry. Let us see what she has to say.
A soft knock sounds at the door. The boy in buttons steps in and announces the visitor.
Miss Mary Sutherland.
A large woman steps into the room behind the boy, looming like a full-sailed merchant ship following a tiny pilot boat. Holmes steps forward, extending his characteristic courtesy.
Miss Sutherland, do come in. Please, take a seat.
As Miss Sutherland settles into the offered armchair, Holmes studies her closely. His gaze is keen, scanning every detail, yet his expression remains abstracted and thoughtful.
Do you not find that with your short sight, it must be rather trying to do so much typewriting?
I did at first, Mr. Holmes. But now I know where the letters are without looking.
She's suddenly realizing the implication of his words. She gasps in surprise.
But, you've heard about me, Mr. Holmes. How could you possibly know that?
It is my business to know things, Miss Sutherland. Perhaps I've trained myself to notice what others overlook. But tell me, why have you come to consult me?
I came to you, sir, because I heard of you from Mrs. Etheridge, whose husband you found so easily when everyone, including the police, had given him up for dead. Oh, Mr. Holmes, I wish you would do as much for me. I'm not rich, but I have £100 a year in my own right, besides what I earned from the typewriter. I would give it all to know what has become of Mr. Hosmer Angel.
Why did you leave your home in such a hurry to consult me, Miss Sutherland?
Miss Sutherland's face, already somewhat vacant, now shows a startled look.
Yes, I came straight to you. It made me mad to see the easy way Mr. Windibank, that is, my father, dismissed the matter. He wouldn't go to the police or to you. He kept saying there was no harm done. Finally, as he refused to do anything, I threw on my things and came here myself.
Your father? No, your stepfather, surely, since the name is different?
Yes, my stepfather. I call him father, though it sounds funny too, for he's only 5 years and 2 months older than me.
And your mother, is she alive?
Oh yes, mother is alive and well. I wasn't best pleased, Mr. Holmes, when she married again so soon after father's death. And to a man nearly 15 years younger than herself. Father was a plumber in Tottenham Court Road, and he left behind a tidy business, which mother carried on with Mr. Hardy, the foreman. But when Mr. Windibank came along, he made her sell the business. He was very superior, you see, being a traveler in wines. They sold it for £4,700 for the goodwill and interest, which wasn't near as much as father could have gotten if he'd been alive.
Watson observed Holmes, expecting impatience at the rambling details. Yet Holmes listened with the utmost concentration.
Your own little income, does it come out of the business?
Oh no, sir. It's separate. It was left to me by my Uncle Ned in Auckland. It's in New Zealand stock, paying 4.5%. £2,500 was the amount, but I can only touch the interest.
You interest me extremely. And since you draw such a large sum as 100 a year, with what you earn into the bargain, I imagine you indulge yourself a little. Travel, perhaps. I believe a single lady can live quite nicely on an income of about £60.
I could do with much less than that, Mr. Holmes, but you understand, as long as I live at home, I don't want to be a burden to them. They have the use of the money while I stay with them. Of course, that's only temporary. Mr. Windibank draws my interest every quarter and pays it to mother. I do fine with what I earn from typewriting. It pays 2 pence a sheet, and I can often do 15 to 20 sheets a day.
You have made your position very clear to me.
Holmes gesturing toward Watson.
This is my friend, Dr. Watson, before whom you can speak as freely as to me. Kindly tell us now about your connection with Mr. Hosmer Angel.
Miss Sutherland's face flushes deeply. She picks nervously at her jacket fringe, hesitating.
I met him first at the gasfitters' ball. They used to send tickets to father when he was alive, and afterward, they sent them to mother. Mr. Windibank didn't want us to go. He never wanted us to go anywhere. He got quite mad if I even wanted to join a Sunday school treat. But this time, I was determined. I would go. What right had he to stop me? He said the people weren't fit for us to know, even though all father's friends would be there. And he said I had nothing to wear, though I had my purple plush dress, still untouched in the drawer. At last, when nothing else worked, he went off to France on business, and mother and I went to the ball with Mr. Hardy, who had been our foreman. It was there I met Mr. Hosmer Angel.
I suppose, then, that when Mr. Windibank returned from France, he was annoyed at your having gone to the ball?
Oh, well, he was very good about it. He laughed, I remember, and shrugged his shoulders. He said there was no use in denying a woman anything because she'd always have her way.
I see. So, at the gasfitters' ball, you met Mr. Hosmer Angel?
Yes, sir. I met him that night. The next day, he called to ask if we'd gotten home safely. After that, I met him twice for walks, but when father came back, Mr. Hosmer Angel couldn't come to the house anymore.
No.
Father didn't like it. He wouldn't allow visitors if he could help it. He used to say that a woman should be happy in her family circle. But as I told mother, a woman needs her own circle first, and I hadn't got mine yet.
And how about Mr. Hosmer Angel? Did he make no attempt to see you?
Father was going to France again in a week. Hosmer wrote to me and said it would be safer if we didn't meet until after father left. We wrote letters instead every day. I brought them in each morning, so father never knew.
Were you engaged to Mr. Hosmer Angel at this time?
Oh, yes, Mr. Holmes. We were engaged after the first walk we took. Hosmer, Mr. Angel, was a cashier in an office on Leadenhall Street, and
What office?
That's the worst of it, Mr. Holmes. I don't know.
Where did he live then?
He slept on the premises.
And you don't know his address?
No, except that it was Leadenhall Street.
Where did you address your letters then?
Miss Sutherland fidgets with her muff, her voice trembling slightly as she explains.
To the Leadenhall Street post office, to be left till called for. He said that if they were sent to the office he would be chaffed by all the other clerks about having letters from a lady. So I offered to typewrite them, like he did his, but he wouldn't have that, for he said that when I wrote them they seemed to come from me. But when they were typewritten he always felt that the machine had come between us. That will just show you how fond he was of me, Mr. Holmes, and the little things that he would think of.
It was most suggestive. It has long been an axiom of mine that the little things are infinitely the most important. Can you remember any other little things about Mr. Hosmer Angel?
Miss Sutherland pauses, her expression softening as she recalls her fiancé.
He was a very shy man, Mr. Holmes. He would rather walk with me in the evening than in the daylight, for he said that he hated to be conspicuous. Very retiring and gentlemanly he was. Even his voice was gentle. He'd had the quinsy and swollen glands when he was young, he told me, and it had left him with a weak throat and a hesitating, whispering fashion of speech. He was always well dressed, very neat and plain, but his eyes were weak, just as mine are, and he wore tinted glasses against the glare.
Well, and what happened when Mr. Windibank, your stepfather, returned to France?
Mr. Hosmer Angel came to the house again and proposed that we should marry before father came back. He was in dreadful earnest and made me swear, with my hands on the testament, that whatever happened I would always be true to him. Mother said he was quite right to make me swear, and that it was a sign of his passion. Mother was all in his favor from the first and was even fonder of him than I was.
Her voice falters slightly, and she looks down at her hands.
Then, when they talked of marrying within the week, I began to ask about father, but they both said never to mind about father, just to tell him afterward. Mother said she would make it all right with him. I didn't quite like that, Mr. Holmes. It seemed funny that I should ask his leave, as he was only a few years older than me, but I didn't want to do anything on the sly, so I wrote to father at Bordeaux, where the company has its French offices. But the letter came back to me on the very morning of the wedding.
It missed him then?
Yes, sir, for he had started to England just before it arrived.
That was unfortunate. Your wedding was arranged, then, for the Friday. Was it to be in church?
Yes, sir, but very quietly. It was to be at St. Saviour's, near King's Cross, and we were to have breakfast afterward at the St. Pancras Hotel. Hosmer came for us in a hansom, but as there were two of us, he put us both into it and stepped himself into a four-wheeler, which happened to be the only other cab in the street.
Her voice grows strained, and her hands clutch her muff tightly.
We got to the church first, and when the four-wheeler drove up, we waited for him to step out, but he never did. When the cabman got down from the box and looked, there was no one there. The cabman said that he could not imagine what had become of him, for he had seen him get in with his own eyes. That was last Friday, Mr. Holmes, and I have never seen or heard anything since then to throw any light upon what became of him.
It seems to me that you have been very shamefully treated.
Oh, no, sir. He was too good and kind to leave me so. Why, all the morning he was saying to me that, whatever happened, I was to be true. and that even if something quite unforeseen occurred to separate us, I was always to remember that I was pledged to him, and that he would claim his pledge sooner or later. It seems strange talk for a wedding morning, but what has happened since gives a meaning to it.
Most certainly it does. Your own opinion is, then, that some unforeseen catastrophe has occurred to him.
Yes, sir. I believe that he foresaw some danger, or else he would not have talked so. And then I think that what he foresaw happened.
But you have no notion as to what it could have been?
None.
One more question. How did your mother take the matter?
She was angry, and said that I was never to speak of the matter again.
And your father? Did you tell him?
Yes, and he seemed to think, with me, that something had happened, and that I should hear of Hosmer again. As he said, what interest could anyone have in bringing me to the doors of the church, and then leaving me? Now, if he had borrowed my money, or if he had married me and got my money settled on him, there might be some reason, but Hosmer was very independent about money and never would look at a shilling of mine. And yet, what could have happened? And why could he not write? Oh, it drives me half mad to think of it, and I can't sleep a wink at night.
Miss Sutherland pulls a small handkerchief from her muff and begins to sob heavily into it. Holmes watches her silently, his expression unreadable.
I shall glance into the case for you, and I have no doubt that we shall reach some definite result. Let the weight of the matter rest upon me now, and do not let your mind dwell upon it further. He pauses, his expression softening slightly. Above all, try to let Mr. Hosmer Angel vanish from your memory as he has done from your life.
Then you don't think I'll see him again?
I fear not.
Then what has happened to him?
You will leave that question in my hands. I should like an accurate description of him and any letters of his which you can spare.
I advertised for him in last Saturday's _Chronicle_. Here is the slip, and here are 4 letters from him.
Thank you. And your address?
Number 31 Lyon Place, Camberwell.
Mr. Angel's address you never had, I understand. Where is your father's place of business?
He travels for Westhouse and Marbank, the great claret importers of Fenchurch Street.
Thank you. You have made your statement very clearly. You will leave the papers here, and remember the advice which I have given you. Let the whole incident be a sealed book, and do not allow it to affect your life.
You are very kind, Mr. Holmes, but I cannot do that. I shall be true to Hosmer. He shall find me ready when he comes back.
Despite her preposterous hat and somewhat vacuous expression, there was a noble quality in her simple faith that commanded respect. She placed the papers delicately on the table and departed, promising to return whenever summoned. Holmes sat in silence for several minutes, his fingers pressed together, legs stretched before him, gaze fixed on the ceiling. At length, he retrieved his old, oily clay pipe from the rack and lit it. Blue clouds of smoke wreathed around him as a look of languid contemplation settled on his face.
Quite an interesting study, that maiden. I found her more interesting than her little problem, which, by the way, is rather a trite one. You'll find parallel cases in my index, Andover in '77, and something similar at The Hague last year. Old as the idea may be, there were 1 or 2 new details. But the maiden herself was most instructive.
You appeared to read a good deal upon her that was invisible to me.
Not invisible, Watson, merely unnoticed. You didn't know where to look, and so you missed everything of importance. I can never bring you to realize the significance of sleeves, the suggestiveness of thumbnails, or the great issues that may hang from a bootlace. Tell me, what did you gather from her appearance? Describe it.
Well, she had a slate-colored, broad-brimmed straw hat with a feather of brickish red. Her jacket was black, sewn with black beads, and fringed with little black jet ornaments. Her dress was brown, darker than coffee, with purple plush at the neck and sleeves. Her gloves were grayish and worn through at the right forefinger. Her boots, I didn't observe those. She had small, round, hanging gold earrings and gave the general impression of being fairly well-to-do in a vulgar, comfortable, easy-going way.
Holmes clapped his hands together softly and chuckled.
"'Pon my word, Watson, you are coming along wonderfully. You've done very well indeed. True, you missed everything of importance, but you've grasped the method and shown a sharp eye for color. Never trust general impressions. Always concentrate on details. My first glance is always at a woman's sleeve. In a man, perhaps the knee of the trouser. As you noted, this woman had plush upon her sleeves, a material most useful for showing traces. The double line near the wrist, where the typewriter presses against the table, was beautifully defined. A sewing machine leaves a similar mark, but only on the left arm and farther from the thumb. This mark, however, was across the broadest part, clearly typewriting. I then observed her face. The pinch marks from a pince-nez on either side of her nose led me to comment on short sight and typewriting. Both observations surprised her.
It certainly surprised me.
But surely it was obvious. I was then struck, upon glancing down, to see that while her boots appeared similar, they were actually odd. A decorated toe cap on one, a plain one on the other. The buttons were mismatched too, two buttoned at the bottom on one, and the first, third, and fifth on the other. A neatly dressed young lady, leaving home in odd, half-buttoned boots. Clearly, she left in a hurry.
And what else?
I noted she wrote a note after fully dressing but before leaving home. Her right glove was torn at the forefinger, and both glove and finger bore violet ink stains. Clearly, she wrote in haste, dipping her pen too deeply. Judging by the freshness of the ink, it was this morning. Elementary, but amusing. Back to business, Watson. Kindly read me the advertisement describing Mr. Hosmer Angel.
Watson holds the printed slip to the light, reading aloud.
Missing on the morning of the 14th, a gentleman named Hosmer Angel. About 5'7" in height, strongly built, sallow complexion, black hair, slightly bald in the center, bushy black side whiskers and mustache, tinted glasses, slight infirmity of speech. Was dressed, when last seen, in a black frock coat faced with silk, black waistcoat, gold Albert chain, and gray Harris tweed trousers, with brown gaiters over elastic-sided boots. Known to have been employed in an office on Leadenhall Street. Anybody bringing?
That will do. As for the letters, they're quite commonplace. Absolutely no clue to Mr. Angel, save that he quotes Balzac once. But there is one remarkable point you may notice.
They're typewritten.
Not only that, but the signature is typewritten. Look at the neat little Hosmer Angel at the bottom. There is a date, you see, but no superscription except Leadenhall Street, which is rather vague. The point about the signature is very suggestive. In fact, we may call it conclusive.
Conclusive? Of what?
My dear fellow, is it possible you do not see how strongly it bears upon the case?
I cannot say that I do unless it were that he wished to be able to deny his signature if an action for breach of promise were instituted.
No, that was not the point. However, I shall write 2 letters, which should settle the matter. One is to a firm in the city, the other to the young lady's stepfather, Mr. Windibank, asking him whether he could meet us here at 6 o'clock tomorrow evening. It is just as well that we should do business with the male relatives. And now, Doctor, we can do nothing until the answers to those letters come, so we may put our little problem upon the shelf for the interim.
Watson gazes at Holmes, struck once more by his friend's confidence. Memories of Holmes' past brilliance, solving the mysteries of the sign of 4 and a study in scarlet, bolster his faith in the detective skills. He rises to leave, convinced that when he returns the next evening, Holmes will hold all the clues to unmask the elusive Hosmer Angel. The next evening, Baker Street. Watson arrives late, worried he might miss the resolution of the case. He bursts into the sitting room to find Holmes lounging in his armchair, surrounded by bottles and test tubes. The acrid smell of chemicals lingers in the air.
Well, have you solved it?
It was the bisulfate of baryta.
No, the mystery.
Oh, that? I thought of the salt I've been working upon. There was never any mystery in the matter, though, as I said yesterday, some of the details are of interest. The only drawback is that there is no law, I fear, that can touch the scoundrel.
Who was he, then, and what was his object in deserting Miss Sutherland?
Before Holmes can reply, heavy footsteps echo down the hall, followed by a sharp rap at the door.
This is the girl's stepfather, Mr. James Windibank. He has written to say he would be here at 6. Come in.
A stocky, clean-shaven man in his early 30s enters. His sallow complexion and sharp gray eyes exude a sly confidence. He glances at Holmes and Watson before carefully placing his top hat on the sideboard and sliding into a chair.
Good evening, Mr. James Windibank. I believe this typewritten letter is yours, confirming our appointment for 6 o'clock.
Yes, sir. I am afraid I am a little late, but I am not quite my own master, you know. I regret that Miss Sutherland has troubled you about this little matter. I believe it's better not to air family disputes in public. It was against my wishes that she came, but she is excitable and impulsive, as you may have noticed. When she's made up her mind, it's difficult to control her. Of course, I don't mind you investigating, as you're not connected with the official police, but it's unpleasant to have such misfortunes noised abroad. Besides, it's futile. How could you possibly find this Hosmer Angel?
On the contrary, I have every reason to believe I will succeed in discovering Mr. Hosmer Angel.
Windibank flinches, dropping his gloves in surprise. Quickly recovering, he forces a smile.
I am delighted to hear it.
It is a curious thing that a typewriter has quite as much individuality as a man's handwriting. Unless they're new, no two machines write exactly alike. Some letters wear out more than others, and some show wear only on one side. In this note of yours, Mr. Windibank, there's a slurring of the and a defect in the tail of the R. There are 14 other characteristics, but those are the most obvious.
We do all our correspondence with this machine at the office. No doubt it's a little worn.
Holmes observes Windibank closely, his piercing gaze unyielding. He picks up the letter again.
And now I will show you what is really a very interesting study, Mr. Windibank.
Sherlock Holmes reclines in his chair, examining the typewritten letters with great interest while Mr. Windibank sits nearby, visibly uncomfortable.
I think of writing another little monograph someday on the typewriter and its relation to crime. It is a subject to which I have devoted some attention. Take these 4 letters which purport to come from the missing man. They're all typewritten. In each case, not only are the E's slurred and the R's tailless, but if you use my magnifying lens, you'll observe the 14 other characteristics I mentioned earlier.
Mr. Windibank suddenly springs out of his chair, grabbing his hat.
I cannot waste time on this sort of fantastic talk, Mr. Holmes. If you can catch the man, catch him, and let me know when you've done it.
Certainly,
Holmes turns the key in the lock, his tone sharpening.
and let me tell you, I've caught him.
What? Where?
Mr. Windibank glances around frantically, his face white as a sheet, his movements rat-like.
Oh, it won't do. Really, it won't. There's no possible way out of it, Mr. Windibank. It's quite too transparent, and you insult me by suggesting it's impossible for me to solve such a simple question. That's right. Sit down and let us talk it over.
Mr. Windibank collapses into a chair, his face ghastly, sweat glistening on his brow.
It's not actionable.
I'm afraid you're correct. It's not actionable. But between us, Windibank, it was as cruel and selfish and heartless a trick as ever came before me, even if petty in scale. Let me walk you through the course of events. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Windibank remains slumped in the chair, head bowed in defeat. Holmes, reclining comfortably, rests his feet on the mantelpiece as he begins to explain.
The man married a woman much older than himself for her money. As long as the daughter lived with them, he enjoyed her income as well. It was considerable for people of their standing, and losing it would have made a serious difference. He wanted to preserve it. The daughter, kind and amiable in nature, was warm-hearted and had fair personal advantages. It was clear she wouldn't remain single for long. Her marriage, of course, would mean the loss of her £100-a-year income. So what does her stepfather do to prevent this? He keeps her at home and forbids her from mingling with people her own age.
But that couldn't have lasted indefinitely.
Exactly, Watson. She became restless, asserting her rights, and finally announced her intention to attend a certain ball. Her stepfather then devises a plan, clever in execution, though heartless in motive. With his wife's connivance, he disguises himself. Tinted glasses mask his piercing eyes, a bushy mustache and whiskers obscure his face, and he sinks his clear voice into a whisper. With the girl's short sight doubly working to his advantage, he appears as Mr. Hosmer Angel, keeping away other suitors by courting her himself.
It was only a joke at first. We never thought she'd be so carried away.
Likely not. But she was indeed carried away. Since she believed her stepfather was in France, suspicion never entered her mind. She felt flattered by the attentions of Mr. Angel, further reinforced by her mother's admiration. Naturally, Mr. Angel continued calling and pushed the matter forward. The meetings, the engagement, it was all calculated to bind her affections and prevent her interest in other men.
And what of the ending?
The deception couldn't last forever. Those pretended trips to France became cumbersome. The logical conclusion was a dramatic ending, leaving the young lady so uncertain of Mr. Angel's fate that she wouldn't look at another man for years. The vows of fidelity upon a testament and the ominous references to potential misfortunes served this purpose. By vanishing at the church door, slipping into a four-wheeler only to exit from the other side, Mr. Windibank ensured the girl would remain faithful to the imaginary Hosmer Angel. I believe that's the chain of events. Wouldn't you agree, Mr. Windibank?
It may be so, or it may not, Mr. Holmes. But if you're so very sharp, you ought to be sharp enough to know that it's you who are breaking the law now, not me. I've done nothing actionable from the start, but as long as you keep that door locked, you leave yourself open to an action for assault and illegal constraint.
The law cannot, as you say, touch you. Yet there was never a man who deserved punishment more. If the young lady had a brother or a friend, he ought to lay a whip across your shoulders. By Jove! It's not part of my duties to my client, but here's a hunting crop handy, and I think I shall just treat myself to.
Holmes takes 2 swift steps toward the whip, but before he can grasp it, the sound of hurried footsteps echoes on the stairs. The heavy hall door bangs shut, and from the window, Holmes and Watson see Mr. James Windibank fleeing at top speed down the road.
There's a cold-blooded scoundrel. That fellow will rise from crime to crime until he does something very bad and ends on the gallows. The case has, in some respects, been not entirely devoid of interest.
I cannot now entirely see all the steps of your reasoning.
Well, of course, it was obvious from the first that this Mr. Hosmer Angel must have some strong motive for his peculiar conduct. Equally clear was the fact that the only person who truly profited from the incident, as far as we could see, was the stepfather. The 2 men were never together. One always appeared when the other was away. That was suggestive. Then there were the tinted spectacles and the curious voice. Both hinted at a disguise, as did the bushy whiskers. My suspicions were confirmed by the peculiar action of typewriting his signature, which inferred that his handwriting was familiar enough to her that she'd recognize even the smallest sample of it. All these isolated facts, together with minor ones, pointed in the same direction.
And how did you verify them?
Once I identified my man, corroboration was easy. I knew the firm for which he worked. Taking the printed description, I eliminated all elements that could result from a disguise, the whiskers, glasses, voice, and sent it to the firm with a request for confirmation. I'd already noticed the peculiarities of the typewriter and wrote to him at his business address, requesting he come here. His reply, as I expected, was typewritten and bore the same trivial but characteristic defects. The same post brought a letter from Westhouse and Marbank of Fenchurch Street, confirming that the description matched their employee, James Windibank. Voilà tout.
And Miss Sutherland?
If I tell her, she won't believe me. You may recall the old Persian saying, "There is danger for him who taketh the tiger cub, and danger also for whoso snatches a delusion from a woman." There is as much sense in Hafiz as in Horace, and as much knowledge of the world.
And this conclude our today's story, friend. Subscribe our channel for more content like this. Stay connected with us.